Towards the end of the 19th century, we see a huge cry for an expansion of democracy, and we also see the expansion of territory in a new imperialism which is taking place, and this is going to lead us towards the 20th century. Between 1870 and 1914, politicians realized they had to share power with the masses without limiting at least men's voices in government. The many revolutions that took place allowed a vast number of people across class lines the opportunity to serve in powerful political positions. Three developments encouraged the demand for democracy: public education, popular journalism, and political campaigns. Many governments began to require free education at the primary or elementary school level. They hoped to encourage patriotism or nationalism, as well as to produce an educated workforce. They also wanted those who could vote to be educated. Since more people were becoming educated, that meant more people could read, so journalism began to grow and spread. Newspapers, to begin with, were small and they were expensive, written for a small audience, those people who could afford them, right? So they're written for rich people. By the end of the century, newspapers were cheap, and they were full of sensational stories, like stories from the front lines, such as from the Crimean War. Political campaigns became different as well. Candidates began traveling across their countries, making stump speeches. You can see a picture from an old movie there, a guy standing on a stump. You know, they literally had to get to a raised area, and sometimes that was a tree that was cut down. And they began working with new interest groups, like labor unions. They also began to try to satisfy the people's cry for help in different areas. Great Britain experimented with democratic reforms. Britain was largely based on liberalism. Remember, this is 19th century liberalism, which stressed limited government and low taxes. It had the most modern economy in the world, but the liberals in government were unwilling to give more power to the people. The conservatives introduced the Reform Bill of 1867, which gave the vote to the lower middle class. Conservatives also passed laws limiting working hours, establishing sanitation codes, and housing standards, as well as helping labor unions. Well, the liberals were not about to be outdone, so in 1884, the liberals pushed another reform bill that gave 2/3 of Britain's male population the right to vote. Still outside the political realm, women were still not allowed to vote. The franchise was not expanded to them. Groups of feminists organized promoting women's issues and demanded legal equality, but it would be years before the female suffrage movement would take hold and actually give female suffrage. Finland led the way. In 1906, they granted women the right to vote. Britain, Germany, and the U.S. did not offer female suffrage until after 1918, and France waited until the 1940s. Switzerland, however, takes the cake by waiting until the 1970s. Thanks a lot, Switzerland. In England, France, and Germany, we see many large trade unions developing at this time. Until the 1880s, unions limited membership to skilled workers, but after the 1880s, unskilled workers were admitted as well. At first, these groups did what they could to help each other out, sometimes raising their political voice, but by the 1880s, unions wanted more than just mutual aid. They wanted more than a basic insurance policy. They wanted to have a much larger political voice. They wanted to have a say in how they were treated. They conducted strikes and were able to influence government proceedings through their votes. They would create a voting bloc. In the U.S., labor unions were hindered because of cheap immigrant labor, as well as capitalists working to keep labor unions very weak by using union busters. But in 1886, the American Federation of Labor was established and became the first successful national labor organization in America. The Haymarket Affair refers to the aftermath of a bombing that took place at a labor demonstration on Tuesday, May 4th, 1886, in Haymarket Square in Chicago. It began as a peaceful rally in support of workers on strike for an 8-hour day. An unknown person threw a dynamite bomb at police as they worked to disperse the meeting. Now, the bomb blast and the gunfire, which resulted after the bomb went off, it brought about the deaths of 7 police officers and at least 4 civilians, and we see tons of others who were wounded. This was internationally publicized, so remember that expansion of journalism. It's spreading across the globe. The legal proceedings were highly publicized and followed. 8 anarchists were convicted of conspiracy. The evidence was that one of the defendants had built the bomb, but none of those on trial had thrown it. 7 were sentenced to death and 1 to a term of 15 years in prison. So this event shows us what it was like to try to strike for better wages. This shows us what it was like, not just in the U.S., but in other industrialized nations, when the people rise up for any sort of reform, you're going to get pushback. And more often than not, it's going to be violent. If you're going after someone's money, it's going to be a violent rejection and a violent resistance to what you're doing. By 1914, unions had become a major power in the U.S. and a major political asset, or the opposite, right? Many union workers adhered to socialism, anarchism, or nationalism, and sometimes it was a combination of those beliefs. These ideologies led to ideas of superiority. In Central Europe, there was a rise in anti-Semitism, or anti-Jewish feelings. When we think about superiority, think back to when we discussed slavery and we discussed the Jim Crow laws. These are ideas of superiority. Some people are just naturally superior or better than others. So, anti-Semitism on the rise. 2 men, Comte de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, wrote that race determined history. And they helped to formulate the idea of Aryan superiority. Spoiler alert, this leads us eventually to Adolf Hitler's, right? Is his ideas, right? These 2 men said that the Germans belonged to a special race, and eventually these thoughts do lead to anti-Semitism. The Jewish population was largest in Central Europe, and so persecution began and increased most aggressively there. Some of the worst anti-Semitic acts took place in Russia. Alexander III and Nicholas II sanctioned persecution of the Jews and forced them to live in designated areas. Jews were blamed for random problems, and eventually the hostility against them led to physical attacks. The European Jewish community began to have feelings of nationalism during this time, so nationalism is increasing. Nationalism is not just limited to people within particular physical borders. This is the idea that a group of people who have a common background come together. And so here we have the Jewish population having feelings of nationalism, and they begin the Zionist movement, or a movement to create an independent state for Jews in Palestine. With a rise in nationalism, we see a rise in imperialism, or the expansion of one's territory. Leopold of Belgium takes the lead with tremendous cruelty. Western leaders realized the great potential for Africa, the great potential that Africa had with its natural resources, and we see a scramble for Africa beginning. Ultimately, there are tons of raw materials that are available: cotton, silk, diamonds, rice, metals, cocoa. There's more than that, but these are just some examples of raw materials that are available. But now, but once you have the raw materials in play, well, suddenly all of the Western leaders, they want a piece of the pie. And so Leopold of Belgium, again, he takes the lead. He's incredibly cruel. He maims people. I say he, the people who are there in charge of the Congo. They maim people. They are terribly brutal in the colonization of the Congo for Belgium. And Western leaders, they're seeing what he's reaping. He's reaping the benefits, which is he's getting increased raw materials, which is only going to increase his wealth. It's going to increase a lot of things, right? So Otto von Bismarck, remember that guy? He's back. He's calling a conference to discuss the scramble for Africa. He's saying, okay, look, we're all fighting over these different raw materials. This is not good. This is going to cause a war. So we need to figure out how we can do this peacefully. So the understanding is that if you control the coast, then you control the rights to the interior. Well, Bismarck says we need to dissect Africa. And if we dissect Africa, then each of us can kind of stay in our own places, right? So there's a linear dissection of Africa. It's meant to quell the rivalry between the different powers. But ultimately, it does lead to more conquest and to further violence. The one ideology that's probably best represented here is social Darwinism. The idea that one race is superior to the other, right? Survival of the fittest and all that jazz. So this is not good. But it's not just happening in Africa. It's also happening in Asia. To protect their interests, Western nations placed strategic exclusions on trade as well as on trade routes, further increasing the rivalry and tension between those rivals grow. So, in Asia, we see Britain creating an Indian state under their control. India brought great wealth to Britain, and in 1857, Indians rebelled against British rule. They want democracy as well. This is sort of a global phenomenon. I say phenomenon, but I'm tired. Anyway, it's a global issue. Lots of people wanting freedom and self-rule. In response, the British had Indian elites enforce British rule, but they were not allowed to have a political voice themselves. So nationalism grew, and in 1885, the Indian National Congress was established, which fought for independence for several years. Now, Britain's hands were also in China. At the beginning of the 1800s, China was convinced that it did not need foreign trade because it produced an abundance of goods for its own markets. And they tried to keep Westerners out, but the West basically came charging in without permission. Japan was similar to China in that it wanted to keep Westerners out, but with the West barging in, they forced trade upon them, and Japan, by the end of the 19th century, took on a lot of Western principles, and they implemented different reforms and became a modern industrialized nation. Several conflicts took place in Asia that ultimately altered cultures and boundaries. So who gets what in Asia? Well, the French and the British gained more land in South Asia. Russia gained land in Northern Asia. Japan gained Korea and Taiwan, and the U.S. gained the Philippines. In the U.S., we have a president during this time, Teddy Roosevelt. Now, of the two Roosevelts, I prefer him, but I really don't like either of them. That's just me. And fewer men were more ardent imperialists than Theodore Roosevelt. By the age of 42, he became the youngest man ever to hold the office of president. he has several impressive presidential achievements. In foreign affairs, he brought the U.S. out of its tradition of isolationism. He intervened in the heavens busy something like that war, the Russo-Japanese War, and helped to bring about peace. On the domestic scene, he reversed the traditional federal policy of laissez-faire, bringing in more socialistic ideology. In all of his policies as chief executive, he expanded the powers and the responsibilities of the presidential office, establishing the model of the modern presidency, which ultimately, in many ways, has been followed by most of his successors in the White House. Throughout his presidency, he sought colonies and ports all over the world to exert American influence. And he summarized his imperialistic tendencies with an old African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." The press instantly latched on to this saying, and they used it to describe Roosevelt's style of foreign policy as big stick diplomacy, such as what you see in the political cartoon. Some from the West may have had good intentions when their country's borders were expanding, but many were prejudiced against those they conquered, and they treated them as inferiors. The West also experienced tensions during this time of imperialism, as the Western nations just barely missed fighting each other in these newly gained territories. But again, Westerners didn't really think about the consequences of their actions, so they couldn't really see the problems that were going to arise out of it. So we're going to leave here. Next time we're going to discuss the Second Industrial Revolution and the progress which is being made, and after that we will enter the 20th century with World War I.